everyone, my name is Liz I Read and welcome to another video, and today I am recommending some stories that have fairies. I've been wanting to make this video for years actually, because some of my favorite paranormal or urban fantasy creatures are fairies, and I just love any story with fairies featured about them. And I think I'll recommend the first thing that kind of introduced me to the world of fairies. But when I'm talking about fairies, I'm specifically talking about the urban fantasy paranormal creature where they live in the Never Never. They're very beautiful. They're basically eternal beings. They have pointy ears. They may have magical abilities, and they usually have different courts within the Never Never. So sometimes there's the spring, fall, winter, and summer courts, and there's usually some kind of political intrigue happening between the different courts. There's always some kind of war. Fairies are usually really jealous of each other. There's a lot of vindictive dynamics. I love everything about it. They're so dramatic and over the top, and they just make my heart swoon. And the type of stories I usually gravitate towards are the human person coming into the Never Never and learning about the world, or somehow they get swept up into the politics of the fairy world. And a lot of these are like that. I'm going to get to the recommendations now. Okay, so the first recommendation I'm going to have for this, and it's what's really introduced me to the world of fairies, is the Iron Fae series by Julie Kagawa. This was the first thing I read about fairies, and I just fell in love with it so much. This is a YA fantasy story, and I just have a soft spot for this series. I'm not sure if it's aged well, but I think the older books are still doing really well, and I've just fallen in love with these characters and this world. And what Julie Kagawa does really well is just write great adventures. She has these characters go on so many different quests and fight so many bad guys that it's just a fun time. So I would recommend this more for the fantasy, the action side of things. The romances aren't my most favorite thing. And the series started, I think, early to mid 2000s. So it is an older series, but she's still writing books. The latest book has come out, I think, this year, and the next book in the series is coming out next year. It's a really long series. There's a total of 8 books right now. But anyways, book 1 is the Iron King, and we follow Megan. One day her half-brother gets taken into the fairy world, finds out she's half fae, and she finds out her best friend is actually fae, and his name is Puck. And some of these characters are created after the Midsummer Night's Dream characters. So Puck is the Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream, and so he takes her into the Never Never to help recover her brother. Her brother's taken to the Iron Realm, which is this new realm that's popped up in the fairy world, where it's based on technology, and it's a big threat to the Never Never. She meets her real father, who is Oberon, King Oberon of the Summer Court, and she also meets Prince Ash, who is the prince of the Winter Realm, who is technically her enemy. And it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of adventure, there's a lot of action, there is romance in here. I really love this world. If you like a good traveling fantasy series, I definitely recommend. The next series I'm going to recommend is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This one we follow Farah, who is human, and her family are on hard times, so she has to hunt to provide food for the family. One day while she's hunting, she stumbles upon a wolf, and she kills it, obviously, because she's hunting for her family. But she learns that it was actually a fairy, and the fairy from the fairy realm takes her to his home for a life for life situation. So she's forced to live with this fairy who happens to be ruler of the spring court, and it's a Beauty and Beast retelling. So it's their story. She grows to really care for Tamlin, that's his name, and he's kind of beastly. He turns into a wolf. He's partially covered his face because he's a mask on, and I love this series so much. The second story is Hades and Persephone retelling. They're not all retellings, but this is a great series, and if you like the Never Never or stories set in the fairy world, I definitely recommend this. The next one is the Cruel Prince series by Holly Black. I've only read book 1, but I loved it when I read it. It's a really good story, and in the story followed Jude, and she has lived in the fairy world her entire life, even though she's a human. She has 2 sisters, and what's happened is when she was quite young, a fairy came and killed her parents, and he takes the girls in as his own, basically. And so they grew up with this fairy, and they are disrespected in the fairy world because they're human. The other fairies don't respect them at all, and they give them a hard time, but they live in luxury, I guess you can say, because the man that they're living with, or the fairy that they're living with, is prominent in this world. And so they are trained like a normal fairy, even though they're human. Anyways, this is like a hate to love romance with one of the princes. His name is Caden, and he just hates her so much. And the story, like, even though it is a hate to love romance, is mostly about like espionage and court politics and things like that. So Jude does a lot of scheming in this book, which is really good and interesting, and she decides she wants to kind of strike out on her own. She doesn't want to go back to the human world. She wants to make a name for herself in the fairy world. So it's really interesting. I need to finish this series. I've heard good things. I've heard not so good things. Like maybe it goes in the direction that people are upset with. But I do want to pick it up again, and I do recommend at least book 1. The next series I recommend is Wings by Aprilynne Pike. This is a different take of the fairy. We follow Laurel, and she lives in the human world, and one day she just sprouts wings. She doesn't understand what the heck is going on, but wings sprout out of her back. And so she hides her wings, and she is on a journey of learning like what's happening to her, what's going on. She eventually finds out, obviously, she's a fairy, but the fairies in this world are very different. They're more like plants, which is kind of weird, but they're plant-based beings, which is so strange, but it's so good. I really enjoy this series a lot. There's a bit of a love triangle in here, but I really like the love triangle. I think it's a lot of fun. She still goes to like high school and things like that, but then she's also like straddling this other world, which I think is just called I think it's Avalon. I think that's what it's called. 4-book series. There's a love triangle between herself and a human boy and a sentry from the fairy world. So, and there's some threat to the fairy world, of course, and Laurel gets swept up into it. And it's a really great series. I love it, and I highly recommend it. The next book I'm going to recommend is Lament by Maggie Stiefvater. This is, I think it's technically 2 books, but I think they might be standalones. I don't quite know, but I've read only book 1, and it reads like a standalone. And this one we follow Deirdre, and she's a musician, and she can also see fairies. There's a mysterious boy who's kind of following her, and she finds out that he's actually like a fairy assassin. He's soulless, he has no soul, and there's another person after her. I think they're both supposed to kill her because of her talent. I really loved it because focused on fairies, and there's people after her, so it's a little bit action-packed. I remember the romance really felt like Twilight-y, but I loved it because it's fairies and it's my favorite. So it's reads a little bit juvenile, I guess you can say, but if you love fairies and if you want a romance, I do recommend this one. The next one I have is Wicked Lovely by Melissa Marr. This one we follow Aislinn, and she can see fairies as well, but she has always tried her best to make sure that they don't know that she can see them. So she does not look at them. She tries not to communicate with them, and she tries really hard to make sure that they are unaware that she can see them. So she's just lived that way her entire life until one day someone starts following her, and he's desperately trying to get in contact with her or talk to her, and it's because she's destined to be his queen. He's the Summer King, that's what it is, and he's been looking for her his entire life because he needs to marry her. She needs to be his queen, and she's not taking this very well, and she also has feelings for this boy named Seth. They've been like friends forever, and so she's really conflicted about this fairy, but also conflicted because she has feelings for Seth. I really enjoyed this one. It was a lot of fun. It reads older, but I liked it because it just reminded me what it was like to be a teenager in that era. And there's a lot of books in the series, but I think each one is kind of like a standalone. Moving on to some books that aren't overly heavily fairy based, but still have elements of fairies in it. So the next one I'm going to recommend is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. This has a lot more fairies in it, and you are part of the fairy world, kind of, but not as much as the Court of Thorns and Roses. So but there are fairy characters in here, and they're quite involved in politics of this world. So in Throne of Glass, book 1, we follow Selena. She is taken to the palace. She was originally in a prison, and the Prince Dorian chooses her to be his champion, and there's a competition, and if she wins the competition, I believe she gets to be free. No, she gets to be the king's champion, meaning she would work for him for a few years, and then eventually she would receive her freedom. And so it's a very popular series. Lots of people love this series. There are fairies involved. You don't see fairies until later on in the series, but if you like a good fantasy series, if you love romance, if you love action, definitely recommend it. The next one is Jackaby series by William Ritter. This is more of an urban fantasy. It is a historical fiction. It's set in New England in 1892, and we follow Miss Rook, and she helps Jackaby solve magical mysteries. He is a seer, so he can see things that people cannot, and there's multiple paranormal creatures. So there's werewolves, vampires, dragons, like there's lots of different creatures in this world, and it's an urban fantasy, so they're still set in the human world. I love this series a lot. It's a lot of fun. If you like a traditional mystery, probably like it. By book 3, there are some fairies introduced, so you have to wait until then. And book 3 reads more urban fantasy, less mystery. My favorite 2 books in the series is probably books 1 and 2 because it leans more mystery. I just like a good traditional mystery. But anyways, I definitely recommend it, and there are some fairies involved. And lastly, I have City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. This one, again, fairies are kind of a minor thing, but they are somehow involved in this world. Follow Clary, and she learns that she's part of the shadow hunter world. So there's shadow hunters are people who hunt demons, and her mother goes missing, so she turns to the shadow hunters to help her find her. She's kind of sucked into this world, and somehow she is involved in the politics and drama. And I believe in book 2 is when fairies are somehow introduced. Again, they're not the major part of this world. It's mostly about demons and fighting demons, but there's vampires and werewolves and fairies in this world. So if you want another YA fantasy with a little bit of fairies involved, here's your recommendation. So those are all the recommendations I have you when it comes to fairies. I love fairies. They're my favorite. What can I say? Anyways, if you've read any of these books before, please comment down below. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions about them. If you have any fairy recommendations, please give them to me because I need them. I need more fairies in my life. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe. If you have not done so, you can follow me on Goodreads and Instagram. And you know what? I want you to keep reading. Bye.